I don't mean to glorify gangs in this documentary. A lot of times when you hear about who's good and who's bad, you know, the politicians, the cops, they're not always the good guys. And there's just good and bad people everywhere you go. The reason Monk Eastman set the stage for gangster funerals is because it was a huge spectacle. There was said to have been over 10,000 people. It was actually a military funeral. He was given a 21-gun salute. The people that he fought with in France were dressed in their army garbs, and he was given a proper send-off. It just set the stage for when somebody in the underworld is appreciated, they get a proper send-off. The more flowers, the better.
All you had to do was look at him and see, you know, the cauliflower ears, the scarred face, and know that he was not one of these gang leaders who sat behind a desk and issued orders.
You used to call him the monkey. He used to look like a monkey. The guy was wild.
It was loud, it was noisy, it was dirty. The Bowery was a pretty rough and tumble place.
You gotta do what they tell you to do, whether it's stealing drugs or beating people up. That's how you move up in the ranks.
If a guy's a fucking thug, you know that that person, if they have the power and the money, and they're gonna get people to do it. You know what I mean? You got a restaurant, you got some friends who are thugs, you got some customer there you don't really like because somebody beats them up, whatever, right?
I mean, even Tammany Hall politicians, these guys were corrupt, right? But they needed men like Eastman to keep people in check and get the votes.
Born into the black market culture of the streets, these forgotten figures carved out their names in history. So you want to talk old New York? Prior to the 20th century's arrival, Manhattan's downtown began major reforms in living conditions. Aforetime to the 5 Points, there was a big pond. The pond had streams that drained into the swamps, rivers, and bay. There is now a recreated pond, and it's called Collect Pond Park. It used to be nice before Europeans occupied the lands. There were fish and deer and bears and eagles and all that good nature stuff. But when the Dutch took over Manhattan, they started shitting in the pond. Before 1800 had arrived, the pond was drained because it became vile. A neighborhood was constructed over the new land, but the damp ground was still too squishy and stinky. Living quarters built looked like shacks and they lacked windows. It quickly became an undesirable place to live. If you lived here, your game plan was to get out. When an adolescent kid named Edward Osterman moved from the Lower East Side to Williamsburg with his family, he had no idea he would someday rule his old haunts as its top gang leader. Growing up in Brooklyn instead of Manhattan was a safer bet, as around this time, the latter's downtown was a pure shithole. BK was bustling too, but it was less tainted with close corners and filthy sardine can living conditions, like there were across the river in the wretched and notorious 5 Points.
Well, that period of time, you have to look back and remember that, first of all, it wasn't very organized. It was very sort of like a teeming city. It's an immigrant neighborhood, so there's a lot of scrambling going on. It's one of the densest populated neighborhoods in the whole world. And that's where you got somebody like a Jacob Riis coming along, showing the poverty that people lived in.
Eventually, a photographer named Jacob Riis went down there and documented the scene. The overpacked, disease-plagued shacks, the huddled orphans on the damp streets, and desperate squabble. He published a book about his recordings in the 1890s, and when the public finally saw, they were outraged. So began the deconstruction of the 5 Points, replaced by a new dwelling of higher standards, the tenements. They were still small, but they had narrow air shafts for more light exposure, taller for more rooms, and bathrooms with running water. Before pigeons were seen as rats with wings, they were admired as pets. This led to young Edward's first occupation as a pigeon ransomer. A tough job for a kid that could have walked the straight and narrow. With no male role model and in an all-women household, he spent his time outside, burgeoning a rough exterior of lacerations from altercations, and took more of a liking to the stray cats than fellow humans. Before he walked back to Manhattan over the Great Bridge, his bullet-headed face was lush with scars from brass knuckles, knives, bottles, fist, and boot. He left Brooklyn and strutted over the bridge in 1892. From that point on, the world would know him as the mysteriously dubbed Monk Eastman. The early actions to define a gangster were less a set of guidelines, as it was more a term adopted by the press. The word gangster first started to be used around the end of the 19th century, around 1895 to 1900. Ending in "ster" actually birthed a proxy of words that now use that to define somebody or a group of peoples, such as teamster or hipster. As the houses and shacks dissipated, the tenements and towers began to blossom. The rough-and-tumble hoodlum didn't mutate into the clean-cut, big-money racketeer overnight. It happened one and the same with the industrial transformation of the metropolis and higher standards of American living. The visions of the mafia were decades from now, so get those Tommy guns, pinky rings, and Ford Model Ts out of your head.
What are you talking about?
But the gangster was born. This era is brushed over, in my opinion, mainly because the mafia, with its Ford Model Ts and Tommy guns and mass amounts of profit being made from alcohol prohibition, all the people before their time just got overshadowed. All the real godfathers are forgotten. My mother grew up in the Lower East Side, and her father was born in the Lower East Side as well. Her grandfather, my great-grandfather, was born in Staten Island in 1904. So on that side of the family, I'm a fifth-generation New Yorker. As for my father, he was born and raised in Sheepshead Bay. His mother was born and raised in Park Slope, and his father was actually born in the Bronx in 1917. Since we arrived from Ellis Island, none of us left New York. The city is all my family knows, and I'm definitely a New Yorker through and through. I never exactly knew where to say I was from. The old yellow cabs that used to have that grid map of downtown with all the different neighborhood names, for my section of Manhattan, there was just a little gray square. There was no name. So I never knew what neighborhood to say I was from. I wanted to know what was in the neighborhood before Stuyvesant Town and Peter Cooper, and I learned about the Gas House District. I stumbled upon this name, Monk Eastman, and I learned that he had a Jewish gang of Lower East Side Jewish gangsters, and they were protected by Tammany Hall. I basically nosedived into this forgotten era of New York that I've never seen a documentary for or a movie or anything. It was like discovering the lost sunken city of Atlantis. As the city defined itself into the mechanical urban land of tomorrow, the working peoples of New York began to form unions for workers' rights. So came the first profession of gangsterdom, strike breaking. It would later be termed as labor slugging. The corruption offered a lot of money, big paydays, anywhere from 10 to 125 grand before it was even 1920. Monk now established himself as someone willing to harm people on the streets to settle disputes. To the underworld, this was the opening gangster act. So these were really the first times gangsters were making six figures in the underworld, ever. You know, no one in the 5 Points was making big money. They were all about like, I have 10 knives on me, I'm a butcher. But they weren't actually gangsters. You know, Bill the Butcher was a butcher. He wasn't a gangster. Monk Eastman did not have any other occupation except for gangster. But before Monk could be a bigger shaker and mover, he was caught with burglar's tools and sentenced to his virgin stint, 3 months at Blackwell Island. In 1898, it was home to a prison and an asylum for the insane. A nice place for Monk to fortify his bravado. When Monk got out of Blackwell's, he decided to try to make a run as a bouncer on the Bowery. Bowery was the main strip. It had an elevated railway, which was just switched from coal to electric power, and the street was wider than all the narrow side streets. Bigger saloons were there, and it was there the nightlife socialites made a name for themselves. It was also there drunkards who overstayed their welcomes get kicked to the curb and left for dead if they couldn't scrounge away.
If a guy's a fucking thug and he likes to have people beaten up, you know that that person, if they have the power and the money, and they're gonna get people to do it. You know what I mean? You got a restaurant, you got some friends who thugs, you got some customer there you don't really like, doesn't pay the bill. Somebody beats him up, whatever, right?
In the late spring, he approached a man named Silver Dollar Smith, who owned a saloon named after him on the Bowery. The entire place was embroidered in silver dollar notes, and he understood the Hebrew peoples of the area. Monk expressed his desire to work as the saloon's bouncer, but Smith declined as he pointed to his two larger bouncers. Smith wasn't a chump either. It was said he gouged a man's eye out some years prior. But Eastman approached both of them and started swinging. They were promptly put to the floor and fired on the spot by the saloon keeper. So it was. Monk Eastman was the new bouncer at Silver Dollar Smith's on the Bowery. He carries common weaponry of the era, a blackjack, brass knuckles, and his trusty bludgeon, which he would carve notches in per victim.
Supposedly he added a notch to that club every time he bashed somebody's head in. Like, whether that's true or not, I don't know. That rumor started back in the days when he was a bouncer.
But if a patron caught him on a good day, he would suggest they stay out of trouble, and the Jewish neighborhood east of Bowery began to grow very fond of him. Monk was a man of puzzling contradictions. He was a brutal thug, but was often seen on the streets with a kitten tucked under his arm or a tame blue pigeon on his shoulder.
I always had sort of an interest in preserving history.
To say that Clayton Patterson is a living legend is an understatement. He was one of the first people to start recording police injustices, and he was on Oprah, like holding the VHS camera talking about, we have power, like there's power in this. You can blow the whistle. And in his words, he said, now little brother is watching big brother.
He refused to hand over his videotapes.
He wrote a couple books that are encyclopedias about Jewish culture in the Lower East Side. He is obsessed with Lower East Side history and outlaw culture.
See, one of the things that happens is there's always suspicion. So if somebody is robbed or something, who do you go to? Well, often, and even to this day, different ethnic groups that are new immigrants do not go to places like the police. They don't trust the police, they don't trust the justice system, they don't believe they'll be honestly treated with. And so that's where you start having internal groups that are supposed to deal with that. And a lot of times they're tough guys.
The anti-hero became friends with a younger lad named Crazy Butch. He also had a band of youth rebels labeled the Squab Wheelmen, part being a bicycle reference. They were enthusiasts not just for sport, but they would scheme via bicycle as well. They would reenact a bicycle collision, only to pick everyone's pockets as a crowd formed around the fallen actors. Butch also gained Monk's notoriety by sending some 5-pointers out the window of their Stuss parlor, the popular card game at the time. He raided them after catching wind of their plotting against. He quickly became Monk's secondary after displaying such chutzpah.
I wanted to go in the streets and live like a gangster. You understand how you move up in the ranks? You deal with drugs. You got to do what they tell you to do, whether it's stealing drugs or beating people up. That's how you move up in the ranks. So you got to knock somebody off that's in the top position, and you do what you got to do to please the leaders.
With their pockets stuffed with .22 caliber revolvers that were legal to carry, they began pimping out the runaways and vagabond women they befriended on the streets. As their underworld dominance grew, they claimed east of Bowery as their stronghold and began referring to themselves by a more formal name, the Eastman Gang. Over 1,000 heads strong, Christie Street was their nerve center. The Eastmans were a band of rough dudes. They sent so many victims to Bellevue Hospital, the nurses designated a section as the Eastman Pavilion. There were also much younger followers. Too young to join, they were dubbed Junior Eastmans, gangsters in training, if you will, the tough Jews of tomorrow.
I don't know a whole lot, but this I know, that the Eastman Gang was one of the biggest gangs in the Lower East Side in New York City, but one of the biggest was Paul Kelly's gang, the 5 Points Gang. Now, it is said that these gangs will go to war with each other.
Born to the first wave of Italian immigrants, Paul Vassarelli quickly adopted an Irish last name. Paul Kelly is what he renamed himself. With winnings from his prize fighting, he opened up an athletic club on Great Jones between Bowery and Lafayette Streets. Paul was doing well and kept making friends with street prestige. He became known as a young, smart, clean-cut socialite, and all knew his hands were well in. He quickly grew an entourage of young Irish, Italian, and Hebrew Americans, and the women were taking notice. His followers claimed the areas between Bowery and Broadway as their stomping grounds, and they named themselves the 5 Points Gang, to pay homage to the neighborhood just before their time.
This battle went on for hours, and 3 people died. Eventually, everybody got tired of these bloodshed and gang wars, and so did Tammany Hall, where they all got together and said, we're going to take these guys to the Bronx, and we're going to have them duke it out with each other. They took them to an old barn in the Bronx, and they go Paul Kelly, the leader of the 4 Points Gang, and Monk Eastman. You used to call him the monkey. He used to look like a monkey. The guy was wild. So they fought for 2 hours. They fought. Nobody won. It was a draw.
The history books need to get rewritten in terms of New York underworld and true crime to include Monk Eastman and his enemy, Paul Kelly. They were the duality of the first gangster. Paul Kelly was the clean-cut version, the clean fingernails, and Monk Eastman was the rough and tumble. New York's industrial metamorphose was extraordinary. The city was a playground for invention. From a building on Fulton and South Streets, electric light was born. The horse-drawn trolleys began to make this transformation as well. It was a cobblestone city from uptown to downtown. They lasted for a while, but once the car came around, all the cobblestones started getting paved over. It was difficult terrain for the exploding fad of bicycling, but that didn't stop it from taking off in popularity. Larger buildings began sprouting up made of pure stone and steel. People started calling them skyscrapers. The elevator was the innovation that enabled this architecture. New music was hitting the scene. vaudeville performances in the theaters for the upper classes, and ragtime piano in the saloons for the bump and grind of man's ruin. Newsies were on the street selling papers for a penny, while baseball was just developing its fundamental rules of play.
Take me out to the ball game.
And Coke had Coke in it. The progressive era had begun, and the European ethnicities started intermingling. With the street gangs leading the way, the New Yorkers developed a native tongue to match their new American swag. For whatever reason, 33rd and 3rd became toity-toid and toyd. It's what we now call the old New York accent. Real old New York, see?
The beginning of the end for Monk took place around 1904. He and an associate named Chris Wallace, one night they followed some young man hoping to, blackjack him and take his money, to rob him essentially. What they didn't know was that he was being followed, he meaning their Mark, was being followed by Pinkerton detectives. The Pinkerton detectives opened fire. There were shots exchanged. Monk and Wallace both ended up being captured. Now, Monk assumed that it was going to be like anything else. His Tammany protectors would swoop in and bail him out the moment word of his arrest came. However, no rescue was forthcoming. And that was at the point where he realized that, maybe the protection was not as solid as he had anticipated.
He tried to mug somebody over in Midtown in 42nd Street and wind up doing 10 years. Out of that 10 years, he did 5. When he came out, most of the gang members of his gang were gone.
The Eastmans were starting to break off into factions because without their leader, it was basically like a chicken with its head cut off, and he wasn't there. Paul Kelly wasn't there after a little while because he survived a shooting in his nightclub. There were different stages of time where the underworld was just left open season for the next round of up-and-coming kids. Profits for these outlaw groups were basic and hand over fist. Robberies varying from sneak thieving to holdups and raids of rival establishments. Extortion of neighborhood businesses and labor slugging jobs. Saloons for drinking, card gambling, and prostitution, but most importantly, rigging elections for Tammany Hall. The heyday of Tammany Hall was before the Cobblestone Wars times. The most corrupt politician Tammany ever knew was Boss Tweed. We're here at the former site of the Ludlow Street prison, which he built and also died in 1878. Like the monster Tammany Hall was, when Tweed died, 3 other people came to take his place. Named after Chief Tammand of the Lenape tribe, the political organization was established long before these days and were oriented around the working class. By 1900, Tammany was as corrupt as it gets. They were quick to befriend these gang leaders before a policeman and would spring them out of a jail cell with a top-shelf lawyer at the drop of a hat, even for murder. So long as the neighborhood voted for Tammany Hall, the gangsters could conduct their criminalities with full immunity. Big Tim Sullivan was the political orchestrator of the politician-gang alliance, with Silent Charlie Murphy and Big Tim Foley at his sides. Monk endured more injuries than most people from any era in time. After all those years, at over the age of 40, he signed up for World War I.
I remember he tried to join the army when the doctors, reading about it, the doctors looked at him and just couldn't believe what they were seeing.
The doctors looked at him and he was covered in scars, and they said, "Mr. Eastman, have you been in a war before?"
And he responded, a lot of little wars.
A lot of little wars in New York City.
And it was said that when he got on the scales, you had to allow for about 2 pounds for the extra lead that was still in his body.
And he humbly got accepted as a doughboy. He fought in France, and he was mustard gassed. He was said to have worn his boots for 10 days straight. He was injured in infirmaries and snuck out to link back up with his Company G, which was pressing on for the Hindenburg Line. You know, Monk Eastman basically won World War I for America, and no one even knows. He should have received a Purple Heart. The guy should have probably been mayor or something. He didn't declare himself legit until he was over 40 as a veteran. By that time, he was just fully stuck to the G code. He couldn't conform. He tried doing a couple little odd jobs, but he found his way back into criminal activity, and it ultimately was his downfall. Every time I tried to get out, they pulled me back in. It's like not even they, you are the they. He was a roughneck since he was a teenager. He didn't even go, 2-3 years legit, not even 1 year. He basically was a career criminal, lifestyle criminal, and he lived by the sword and died by it.
New York always had a way of going back. Like if I take the history of the Lower East Side, there was always something that took it back. Gentrification was always biting the heels to change the Lower East Side. And then what happened is World War I, or the Depression, or World War II, or a new immigration group came into, and it always sort of pushed it back. New York now can never go back to the old New York because it's been gentrified so much, the Lower East Side for sure, that it can never go back to what it was.
You know, a lot of people say they miss the old New York, and they think about like punk rock and hip hop in 1977. They think about CBGBs, but they don't even know there used to be an elevated train track on the Bowery. There was a New York before all this, and there's a lot of eras of forgotten time periods. The Cobblestone Wars is one of the most forgotten time periods in New York City history. Soon, the plot lines thicken within these handfuls of original American gangsters. Born into the black market culture of the streets, the dark side of capitalism, the underbelly of the beast, these forgotten figures carved out their names in history. Within the archives of these bandits and their political bosses, we get the facts straight once and for all. Uncovering the lost street stories that slip through the cracks of the Cobblestone Wars. I always had a crew of people, like while I was growing up, whether it was through graffiti or skateboarding and music, like punk rock, hip hop. You just always had to be in a group. It was better off to be in a group. The streets weren't always the best, you know. I grew up in the 90s, and it was a more dangerous time in the 90s. The bottom line was there was safety in numbers, and I definitely relate to the gangs of the Cobblestone Wars in that manner. Also, just in a geographical sense, we were on the same streets that the Eastmans and the Five Pointers were. So if I was born 100 years in the past, I very well might have ended up being in one of those crews. Monk's nickname was of mysterious origins. Some said it was because he jumped from roof to roof so well, like a monkey. And other people said it was because of his fond habit of opium, as a reference to Asian monks. Whatever the reason the nickname was, it stuck, and he was known as Monk Eastman, ruler of the Eastman Gang, 2,000 strong.